What would you do if the man sworn to protect your town was the same man who made suspects scream through the night? In the scorching summer of 1891, the small mining town of Silver Ridge, Nevada, found itself caught between two nightmares. A series of brutal murders that left families shattered, and a lawman whose methods were so savage that even hardened outlaws whispered his name with fear. This is the true story of Sheriff Clayton Briggs, a man who believed that justice had no rules, that mercy was weakness, and that the badge on his chest gave him the right to do things that would make the devil himself look away. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. When it was all over, when the screams had faded and the blood had dried, the people of Silver Ridge didn't run him out of town. They didn't demand his arrest. They didn't even question what he had done. Instead, they built him a statue. They named a street after him. They called him a hero. And for over a century, that's exactly what history remembered him as, until someone finally dug deep enough to uncover what really happened in that jail cell. And what they found was so horrific that it changed everything we thought we knew about the Old West and the thin line between law and brutality. The story begins not with Sheriff Briggs, but with a crime so heinous that it would set everything else in motion. On the night of June 14, 1891, the Williamson family was slaughtered in their homestead just outside Silver Ridge. Thomas Williamson, his wife Margaret, and their two young daughters, ages 7 and 9, were found dead in their beds, their throats cut with such precision that the local doctor said it had to be someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But it wasn't just the murders that shocked the community. It was what the killer had done afterward. The family's savings, nearly $3,000 in gold coins that Thomas had been accumulating for years, was gone. Every piece of jewelry Margaret owned had been stripped from her body, and scrawled on the wall in what investigators later confirmed was Thomas Williamson's own blood were the words, "They had it coming." The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through Silver Ridge, a town of barely 800 souls where everyone knew everyone, where doors were rarely locked, where the idea that someone among them could do something so monstrous was almost incomprehensible. Sheriff Clayton Briggs was 42 years old when he caught the case, a bear of a man, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with hands that looked like they could crush bone and a face that seemed carved from granite. He had been sheriff for 6 years, having taken the job after his predecessor was killed in a shootout with cattle rustlers. Briggs had a reputation, even then, for being tough, uncompromising, and absolutely relentless when it came to tracking down criminals. He had served as a Union soldier during the Civil War, had fought in some of the bloodiest battles of that conflict, and had seen things that would have broken lesser men. Those who knew him said the war had changed him, had stripped away whatever softness he might have once possessed and replaced it with something cold and hard and utterly without mercy. His wife had left him 3 years earlier, taking their only son with her, and those who remembered said she had looked terrified the day she boarded that stage, though she never spoke publicly about why she was leaving. Briggs never spoke about it either, and the few men who were foolish enough to ask found themselves on the wrong end of his temper. Within 24 hours of discovering the bodies, Briggs had his first suspect. Jacob Mercer was a drifter who had been working odd jobs around Silver Ridge for the past 2 months, a quiet man in his late 20s with a slight build and nervous eyes who mostly kept to himself. Someone reported seeing him near the Williamson homestead on the afternoon before the murders, and that was enough for Briggs. He found Mercer sleeping in the barn where he had been staying, dragged him out of his bedroll, and threw him in a cell before the man was even fully awake. Mercer insisted he was innocent, said he had been at the saloon playing cards the night of the murders, said at least 5 people could vouch for him. But Briggs wasn't interested in alibis. He wanted a confession, and he wanted it fast, because the entire town was terrified and demanding justice.
What happened next would only come to light many years later, when a reporter named Samuel Harrison began investigating Briggs's career for a book he was writing about frontier law enforcement. Harrison tracked down court documents, medical records, and most importantly, the testimony of Deputy Frank Morrison, who had worked under Briggs, and who on his deathbed in 1934 finally felt compelled to tell the truth about what he had witnessed. According to Morrison's testimony, which was recorded by a local priest and later verified by Harrison through other sources, Briggs began interrogating Jacob Mercer within an hour of his arrest. The interrogation room was in the basement of the jailhouse, a windowless stone chamber that had originally been built as a storage cellar. Briggs took Mercer down there alone, despite Morrison's suggestion that another deputy should be present, and for the next 6 hours, the only sounds that came from that basement were Mercer's screams. Morrison described waiting upstairs, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as those screams went on, sometimes rising to shrieks so piercing that they could be heard even through the thick stone walls, sometimes fading to whimpers and pleading, and then rising again as whatever Briggs was doing intensified. When Briggs finally emerged, his shirt was soaked with sweat, despite the cool underground temperature. His knuckles were split and bleeding, and there was a look in his eyes that Morrison said haunted him for the rest of his life. Mercer was carried out on a stretcher, barely conscious, his face so swollen that he was unrecognizable. Several of his fingers bent at unnatural angles, and his body covered in burns that Morrison later learned came from cigars that Briggs had pressed against his skin. But Mercer hadn't confessed. Despite everything Briggs had done to him, despite 6 hours of torture that would violate every conceivable standard of law enforcement, even by the rough standards of the Old West, Jacob Mercer had maintained his innocence. Here's where the story takes an even darker turn, and if you're finding this account disturbing, if you're wondering how this could possibly get worse, then you need to understand something crucial about Sheriff Clayton Briggs. He saw any resistance to his authority as a personal insult, and he absolutely could not tolerate the idea that someone he believed to be guilty might escape justice. The next morning, despite Mercer's condition, despite the fact that the young man could barely stand and was coughing up blood, Briggs dragged him back down to that basement. This time, according to Morrison's testimony, the session lasted 9 hours. The deputy said he couldn't take it anymore, said the sounds coming from that basement made him physically ill. So he left the jailhouse and spent the day in the saloon trying to drink away what he was hearing.
But Briggs wasn't done, not even close, because he had 3 more suspects in his sights, and his methods were about to become even more extreme. The second suspect was a Mexican immigrant named Carlos Rodriguez who worked at the local stable. Someone had reported seeing a Mexican man near the Williamson property a week before the murders, and in the racist atmosphere of the time, that was enough to make Rodriguez a suspect, despite the fact that he had been working at the stable the night of the murders and his employer could confirm it. Briggs arrested Rodriguez on the 3rd day of the investigation, and according to court records that Harrison uncovered, Rodriguez never even made it to trial.
He died in custody 5 days after his arrest, and the official cause of death was listed as fell downstairs. But Harrison tracked down the town doctor who had examined Rodriguez's body, a man named Dr. Theodore Walsh, who in his private journals, which were discovered after his death, described injuries consistent with severe and prolonged beating, including a fractured skull, broken ribs, and internal bleeding that could only have come from repeated trauma to the torso. The third suspect was a young man named Daniel Cooper, barely 20 years old, who had been in some minor trouble with the law before, mostly petty theft and public drunkenness. Cooper's mistake was that he had been bragging in the saloon about coming into some money, and when pressed about where this money came from, he had given vague and contradictory answers. Briggs heard about this, and Cooper found himself in that basement within hours. What happened to Cooper over the next 4 days is documented in medical records that Harrison obtained from the county archives, records that described injuries so extensive that 3 different doctors who examined him said they had never seen a human being so thoroughly brutalized and still alive. His left arm was broken in 2 places. His right hand had been crushed so severely that he would never regain full use of it. He had burns across his chest and back. One of his ears had been partially torn off, and according to one doctor's notation, there were signs of trauma that suggested Briggs had used implements, not just his fists, to inflict punishment. The fourth and final suspect was a man named Henry Blackwood, a former soldier like Briggs who had drifted into Silver Ridge a few months before the murders. Blackwood had a violent past, had been court-martialed from the Army for assaulting a superior officer, and had spent time in military prison. On paper, he seemed like the perfect suspect, the kind of man who could absolutely commit a crime like the Williamson murders. Briggs arrested Blackwood on the 8th day of the investigation, and according to witnesses, Blackwood actually laughed when Briggs read him the charges, said something along the lines of, "You've got nothing on me, Sheriff, and we both know it." That laughter, that defiance, was the worst thing Blackwood could have done because it guaranteed that Briggs would make an example of him.
Now, before we go any further, I want you to take a moment and think about what you're hearing, because this isn't just a story about police brutality or abuse of power. This is a story about how an entire community became complicit in evil, how good people convinced themselves that terrible things were acceptable if they were done in the name of safety, and how history can be rewritten to turn monsters into heroes. If you're disturbed by what you're hearing, good, you should be. And I encourage you to leave a comment below telling me what you think about this case, because we need to have honest conversations about the dark side of the Old West and the myths we've been told about frontier justice. And make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because we're going to be diving deep into more stories like this, stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about American history, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. What Briggs did to Henry Blackwood over the next week would eventually become the central focus of the scandal that would erupt years later when the truth finally came out. Unlike the other suspects, Blackwood was a tough man, hardened by war and prison, not someone who would break easily under physical torture. So Briggs adapted his methods. According to testimony that would later be gathered from multiple sources, including guards who worked at the jail and townspeople who lived near enough to hear what was happening, Briggs employed a technique he had learned during the war, something he had seen Confederate interrogators use on captured Union soldiers. It was called the water treatment, and it was a predecessor to what we now call waterboarding. Briggs would strap Blackwood to a tilted board, cover his face with a cloth, and pour water over the cloth, creating the sensation of drowning. Unlike beating someone, this method left no visible marks, no broken bones, no burns, just pure psychological terror
as the victim's brain screamed that they were dying, even as their body continued to function. Deputy Morrison's testimony described hearing this happening, described the sounds of Blackwood gagging and choking, the splash of water being poured. Briggs's voice calm and methodical as he asked again and again, "Did you kill the Williamson family?" And then the process starting over when Blackwood couldn't answer or wouldn't give the answer Briggs wanted. Morrison said this went on for hours at a time, multiple sessions per day, and that by the end of the first week, Blackwood's screams had changed, had become something that didn't even sound human anymore. But Blackwood still hadn't confessed, and neither had any of the other suspects. And this created a serious problem for Sheriff Clayton Briggs. He had 4 men in custody, 4 men who he had publicly declared were responsible for the Williamson murders, 4 men who he had tortured for days or weeks trying to extract confessions, and he had exactly 0 evidence linking any of them to the crime.
This is where the story reveals the true depth of Briggs's corruption and the complicity of the town in what he was doing. On the 16th day after the Williamson murders, Briggs called a town meeting. According to newspaper accounts from the Silver Ridge Gazette, which Harrison obtained from historical archives, nearly the entire adult population of the town showed up. Briggs stood before them and gave a speech that would have been shocking if anyone had been willing to see it for what it was. He told them that he had 4 men in custody who he was certain were responsible for the murders. He told them that these men were hardened criminals, dangerous individuals who would kill again if they were released. He told them that, unfortunately, due to the secretive nature of how they had planned and executed the crime, obtaining evidence that would hold up in court was proving difficult. And then he said something that should have sent chills down everyone's spine. He said that sometimes, in order to protect the innocent, the law needed to be flexible. That sometimes traditional methods of justice were too slow, too lenient, too bound by rules that criminals knew how to exploit. The crowd's reaction, as reported in the newspaper and corroborated by several diary entries that Harrison discovered from townspeople who attended the meeting, was overwhelmingly supportive. People cheered. They thanked Briggs for his hard work. Several prominent citizens stood up and gave speeches praising the sheriff for his dedication to keeping Silver Ridge safe. One man, a wealthy mine owner named Horace Pemberton, publicly pledged $500 to support whatever means Sheriff Briggs deems necessary to ensure justice is served. Not a single person in that meeting, at least not publicly, questioned what Briggs was doing. Not a single person asked about the screams that could be heard coming from the jail. Not a single person demanded that these suspects be given a fair trial or that evidence be presented before they were punished further. The town had decided, collectively and consciously, that whatever Briggs was doing was acceptable because they were afraid. And fear has a way of making people ignore their conscience. When news of the necklace reached Silver Ridge 3 weeks after the murders, it should have been a moment of triumph for justice, a clear lead that pointed to the real killer. Instead, it became the moment when Sheriff Clayton Briggs' entire house of cards began to collapse. Hutchins was arrested and under questioning, not by Briggs, but by a federal marshal who happened to be passing through town and who had jurisdiction over crimes involving stolen property transported across state lines. Hutchins confessed within hours. He provided details about the murders that only the killer could have known. He led authorities to where he had hidden the rest of the stolen jewelry. He explained his motive, his planning, his execution of the crime. And suddenly, inevitably, attention turned to what Briggs had been doing to the 4 men he had been holding. You might expect that this would be the moment when Briggs faced justice himself, when the town turned on him when he was arrested and charged with assault.
torture, and in the case of Carlos Rodriguez, possibly even murder. You would be wrong. What actually happened reveals something deeply disturbing about human nature and about how communities respond when confronted with the evil they've enabled. The town of Silver Ridge, almost to a person, rallied around Briggs. The narrative that quickly took hold was that, yes, perhaps his methods had been extreme, but he had been trying to protect the community. Yes, perhaps he had been wrong about these particular suspects, but in a dangerous world, sometimes mistakes were made. Yes, perhaps innocent men had been hurt, but wasn't it better to be overly vigilant than to let guilty men go free? The mental gymnastics that people performed to avoid confronting what had really happened, to avoid acknowledging their own complicity in torture, would be almost impressive if they weren't so horrifying. Jacob Mercer, the first suspect, tried to press charges against Briggs. He filed a formal complaint with the territorial authorities, described in detail what had been done to him, showed him his scars and his still healing injuries. The complaint was investigated by a territorial judge named Marcus Henderson, and here's where the corruption of the system becomes clear. Judge Henderson interviewed Briggs, interviewed several townspeople, and then issued a ruling that cleared Briggs of any wrongdoing. His justification, preserved in court records, was that Briggs had been operating in good faith based on evidence available at the time, that interrogation of suspects was within his authority as sheriff, and that while some degree of physical coercion may have occurred, this was standard practice in law enforcement of the era and did not rise to the level of criminal conduct. Henderson actually praised Briggs in his ruling, commended him for his zealous dedication to protecting the citizens of Silver Ridge, and suggested that Mercer should be grateful he wasn't being charged with filing a false complaint. Daniel Cooper, the young man whose hand had been crushed and whose body bore the scars of burns and beatings, left town as soon as he was released from custody. He never spoke publicly about what happened to him, but Harrison tracked down his descendants and obtained letters that Cooper had written to his sister in which he described his time in Briggs's custody in heartbreaking detail. Cooper wrote about the physical pain, about how Briggs had told him over and over that he was going to confess eventually, that everyone confessed, that the pain would only stop when he admitted what he had done. But more than the physical torture, Cooper wrote about the psychological destruction, about how being tortured by the man who was supposed to represent law and order had shattered his faith in justice, in authority, in the very idea that there was any protection for the innocent. Cooper developed severe alcoholism in the years after his ordeal, lost contact with his family, and died alone in a boarding house in San Francisco in 1903 at the age of 32. Henry Blackwood, the former soldier who had endured a week of waterboarding and other tortures, responded differently. He stayed in Silver Ridge just long enough to heal from his injuries, and then one night he walked into the saloon where he knew Briggs would be drinking. Witnesses said Blackwood stood in the doorway for a long moment, just staring at the sheriff, and then he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're a coward and a disgrace to that badge. You tortured me for days because you couldn't solve a crime, because you needed someone to blame to make yourself feel powerful. You're not a lawman. You're just a thug with a title, and one day people will see you for what you really are." Briggs stood up, his hand going to his gun, and for a moment everyone in the saloon thought there was going to be a shootout. But Blackwood didn't reach for a weapon. He just turned and walked out, got on his horse, and rode out of Silver Ridge. He was later reported to have become a ranch hand in Montana, married, had 3 children, and lived quietly until his death in 1921. In a letter he wrote to a friend in 1915, which Harrison obtained from family archives,
Blackwood said that his greatest regret was not shooting Briggs when he had the chance, because he knew that Briggs would hurt others the way he had hurt him. Jacob Mercer, after his complaint was dismissed, also left Silver Ridge, but he didn't go quietly. He traveled to San Francisco and met with several newspaper editors, trying to tell his story, trying to expose what Briggs had done. Most wouldn't touch it, didn't want to anger the powerful mining interests that had connections to Silver Ridge, didn't want to seem like they were opposing law enforcement, or simply didn't believe that a sheriff would do such things. But one editor, a man named Charles Morgan at the San Francisco Chronicle, found Mercer credible and assigned a reporter to investigate. That reporter traveled to Silver Ridge, interviewed townspeople, tried to see court records, and ran into a wall of silence. No one would talk to him. Those who did speak defended Briggs. The reporter wrote a draft of an article detailing what he had learned, but his editor ultimately killed the story, deciding it was too controversial and too difficult to verify without cooperation from local authorities. Mercer, defeated and broken, eventually moved to Oregon, where he worked as a farmhand and died in 1907. His gravestone, which Harrison photographed for his book, bears only his name and dates. No epitaph, no indication of what he had endured.
The fourth victim, Carlos Rodriguez, couldn't tell his story because he was dead, and his death highlights perhaps the most tragic element of this entire affair. Rodriguez had left behind a wife and 3 young children in Mexico, and he had been sending money home to them regularly. When he stopped sending money, his wife traveled to Silver Ridge to find out what had happened. She arrived to discover that her husband was dead, that he had been buried in a pauper's grave, that his few possessions had been sold to cover the cost of his burial, and that no one in town seemed to think his death was anything worth investigating. She tried to demand answers, tried to insist on an inquest, but she spoke limited English, had no money for a lawyer, and found herself up against a system that had absolutely no interest in admitting that an innocent man had been killed. Eventually, she returned to Mexico, taking with her only the knowledge that her husband had died alone and in pain in a foreign country, tortured to death by a man who faced no consequences for his actions. And Sheriff Clayton Briggs? He continued as sheriff of Silver Ridge for another 12 years. During that time, he developed a reputation as one of the most effective lawmen in Nevada, was frequently cited in newspapers as an example of frontier justice done right, and was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about his techniques for obtaining confessions and solving crimes. He never expressed any regret for what he had done to those 4 men. In fact, in an interview he gave to a Denver newspaper in 1897, he was asked about the Williamson murder case and whether he had any second thoughts about his handling of the suspects. His response, preserved in the newspaper archives, was chilling in its complete lack of self-awareness or remorse. He said, "Sometimes in the pursuit of justice, hard men have to do hard things. Those men I questioned were vagrants, drifters, troublemakers. Maybe they didn't kill the Williamsons, but they had guilty consciences about something, and if my interrogation made them think twice about committing crimes in the future, then I'd say I did them a favor. The real tragedy is that good people waste their sympathy on men like that instead of remembering the innocent family that was slaughtered." If you're feeling angry right now, if you're disturbed by what you're hearing, then you're having exactly the right reaction. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what you think should have happened to Briggs. Tell me whether you think the townspeople who enabled him were as guilty as he was. Tell me whether you believe our justice system has really evolved that much from those days, or whether we still see examples of authority being abused and communities looking the other way. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we're diving deep into the darkest corners of American history on this channel, telling the stories that textbooks leave out and exposing the truth about the myths we've been told about heroes and villains in the Old West.
The story of Clayton Briggs might have ended there, might have been just another forgotten chapter of frontier brutality, if not for Samuel Harrison, the reporter who decided in 1932 to write a comprehensive book about law enforcement in the Old West. Harrison was working for the Sacramento Bee at the time, and he had become interested in frontier justice after covering a trial in which a police officer was accused of beating a suspect. During that trial, the defense attorney had argued that such tactics were traditional and acceptable, citing numerous historical examples of lawmen who had used physical coercion in interrogations. One of the examples cited was Sheriff Clayton Briggs of Silver Ridge, who the attorney described as a legendary lawman who had never lost a case and whose methods, while tough, had been effective. Something about that characterization bothered Harrison, some instinct that told him there was more to the story, and he began to dig. Harrison's investigation would take him 3 years and would become his obsession. He traveled to Silver Ridge, which by the 1930s had declined significantly as the mining industry dried up and was now a town of barely 200 people. Many of the people who had lived there during Briggs's time were dead, but some remained, and Harrison interviewed them extensively. What he discovered was that over time, as the people who had witnessed Briggs's brutality aged and approached death, some of them had begun to feel guilt about what they had allowed to happen. Deputy Frank Morrison's deathbed confession was the key that unlocked everything else, because once Harrison had that testimony, he could approach others and say, "I already know what happened, I just need you to confirm it," and that made people more willing to talk. Harrison tracked down medical records, court documents, newspaper articles, personal letters, and diary entries. He found the descendants of the 4 tortured men and obtained their family histories and correspondence. He even managed to find and interview Henry Blackwood, who was in his 70s by then and living in Montana. And Blackwood's testimony, delivered by a man who had carried the trauma for over 40 years, was devastating in its detail and its pain.
Harrison's book, titled The Badge and the Blood, The True Story of Sheriff Clayton Briggs, was published in 1935, and it caused a sensation. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. Editorial writers condemned Briggs and the system that had protected him. Legal scholars wrote about the case as an example of how law enforcement could go wrong without proper oversight. The book became a bestseller, and suddenly, the heroic narrative that had surrounded Briggs for decades was being challenged. But here's what's fascinating and disturbing. The response from Silver Ridge itself was largely negative toward Harrison, not toward Briggs. Many of the remaining old-timers who had lived through the era defended Briggs, insisted that Harrison had exaggerated or misunderstood what had happened, claimed that frontier justice was necessarily rough, and that modern critics couldn't understand what it was like to live in a lawless time. The statue of Briggs that had been erected in the town square in 1905, a bronze figure depicting him with a stern expression and a hand on his gun, remained standing, and efforts by some reformers to have it removed were voted down by the town council. Clayton Briggs himself had died in 1919 at the age of 70, having lived long enough to see automobiles replace horses, having seen the wild frontier become increasingly civilized, having watched as the methods he had championed fell out of favor in most jurisdictions. He died of a heart attack in his home, surrounded by commendations and awards from various law enforcement organizations, and his funeral was attended by hundreds of people who considered him a hero. The local newspaper's obituary, which Harrison reprinted in his book, praised Briggs as a stalwart defender of justice, a man who never backed down from his duty, and a symbol of the strength and determination that built the West. There was no mention of the 4 men he had tortured. There was no mention of Carlos Rodriguez dying in his custody. There was no acknowledgement that his career had been built on brutality and abuse of power. History, at least the history that Silver Ridge wanted to tell, had decided that those things didn't matter or hadn't happened. The controversy over Harrison's book raged for several years, but ultimately it changed very little. The statue of Briggs remained standing in Silver Ridge until 1974, when it was finally removed, not because of any moral reckoning, but because the bronze was valuable and the town needed money, and someone suggested selling it for scrap. The street named after him in Silver Ridge still bears his name today. There is no memorial to Jacob Mercer, Daniel Cooper, Henry Blackwood, or Carlos Rodriguez. There is no plaque acknowledging what was done to them. If you visit Silver Ridge now, which few people do because it's barely more than a ghost town, you can still see the old jailhouse where these men were tortured, and it's actually been converted into a small museum about frontier law enforcement that treats Briggs as a significant but controversial figure, rather than the monster that the evidence clearly shows he was.
But the story doesn't end there, because the legacy of Clayton Briggs extends far beyond one small town in Nevada. His methods, his philosophy that the ends justify the means when it comes to law enforcement, his belief that some people don't deserve the protection of legal rights. These ideas didn't die with him. Throughout the 20th century, and even into the 21st, we've seen examples of law enforcement officers who believed that torture was acceptable if it produced results, who believed that suspects who they were convinced were guilty didn't deserve humane treatment, who believed that the badge gave them the authority to do whatever they deemed necessary. Every time we hear about a suspect being beaten in custody, every time we learn about coerced confessions that led to wrongful convictions, every time we discover that authorities have been using torture and calling it enhanced interrogation, we're seeing the ghost of Clayton Briggs and the philosophy he represented. The 4 men that Briggs tortured represent thousands upon thousands of people throughout history who've been victimized by those in power, who've been denied justice because the system was designed to protect authority rather than innocence, who have had their lives destroyed or ended by people who faced no consequences for their actions. Jacob Mercer's desperate attempts to get someone to listen to his story, to acknowledge what had been done to him, echo across the decades in every voice that has been silenced or ignored when speaking truth about abuse of power. Daniel Cooper's descent into alcoholism and early death represent the long-term trauma that torture inflicts, the way it destroys not just the body, but the soul, the way it leaves victims unable to function in a world that seems to have no justice in it. Henry Blackwood's dignity in confronting his torturer, his choice to walk away rather than become a killer himself, represents the strength it takes to resist the urge for vengeance and to maintain your humanity in the face of inhumanity. And Carlos Rodriguez's death represents the ultimate price that the powerless pay when the powerful are not held accountable.
What makes the Clayton Briggs story so important, what makes it worth remembering and retelling, is not just that it happened, but that it was allowed to happen, that it was defended, that it was celebrated, and that even after the truth came out, so many people refused to confront it honestly. The townspeople of Silver Ridge were not monsters. They were ordinary people who convinced themselves that terrible things were necessary for their safety. The judges and officials who cleared Briggs of wrongdoing were not corrupt in the sense of taking bribes or deliberately perverting justice. They were products of a system that valued order over rights and that gave almost unlimited discretion to law enforcement. The newspapers that praised Briggs were not propaganda outlets. They were reflecting the genuine beliefs of many Americans that the frontier required rough men using rough methods. And that's what makes this story so chilling, because it shows how ordinary people, ordinary institutions, ordinary communities can enable and celebrate evil when they're convinced it's for a good cause. Harrison's book concluded with a powerful warning that seems even more relevant today than when he wrote it nearly 90 years ago. He wrote, "The question is not whether Clayton Briggs was a bad man who did bad things. The evidence on that point is overwhelming and undeniable. The real question is why so many good people enabled him, defended him, and continued to honor him even after his crimes became known. The answer to that question tells us something deeply uncomfortable about ourselves and our society. We want to believe in heroes, especially heroes who protect us from threats. We want to believe that the people in authority are the good guys and that anyone they target must be bad. We want to believe that if someone is being treated harshly by law enforcement, they must have done something to deserve it. These beliefs are comfortable and comforting, but they are also dangerous because they blind us to injustice happening right in front of us, and they make us complicit in that injustice. The lesson of Clayton Briggs is not that there are bad lawmen. That will always be true, but that communities have a responsibility to hold their protectors accountable, and that when we fail in that responsibility, we lose the right to call ourselves civilized." In the years since Harrison's book, there have been periodic attempts to get official recognition of what happened to the 4 men that Briggs tortured. In 1968, a civil rights organization petitioned the Nevada state government to issue a formal apology and to provide compensation to the descendants of the victims. The petition was denied on the grounds that too much time had passed and that the state could not be held responsible for the actions of local law enforcement from decades earlier. In 1991, on the 100th anniversary of the Williamson murders and the subsequent torture of the suspects, a group of historians and activists tried to get a memorial erected in Silver Ridge to honor the 4 victims. The town council voted it down, with one council member saying that we need to stop dwelling on negative history and focus on positive aspects of our heritage. In 2003, a documentary filmmaker created a short film about the case and submitted it to various film festivals. But it struggled to find an audience because, as one festival programmer told the filmmaker, people don't want to watch depressing stories about bad things that happened a long time ago. They want heroes and inspiration. And that, ultimately, is why this story matters, and why it needs to be told and retold. History is not just a collection of facts and dates. It's a narrative that we construct about who we are and where we came from. When we choose to remember only the heroes and ignore the villains, when we celebrate law enforcement without acknowledging its abuses, when we tell sanitized stories about the Old West that focus on brave sheriffs and ignore the countless people whose rights were violated or whose lives were destroyed, we're not just being historically inaccurate, we're being morally complicit. We're choosing comfort over truth, and that choice has consequences because the same patterns repeat themselves in every generation when people refuse to learn from the mistakes and atrocities of the past. The story of Sheriff Clayton Briggs and the 4 men he tortured should be taught in every American history class, should be included in every discussion of law enforcement reform, should be referenced in every debate about the proper limits of police power and the importance of civil rights protections. But it won't be, because it's uncomfortable, because it challenges our myths about frontier justice and the noble lawman, because it forces us to confront the reality that our heroes are often more complicated and sometimes more monstrous than we want to believe. So it falls to us, to people who are willing to dig into the dark corners of history, to tell these stories and to make sure they're not forgotten. It falls to us to honor the memory of Jacob Mercer, Daniel Cooper, Henry Blackwood, and Carlos Rodriguez by refusing to let their suffering be erased or minimized. It falls to us to hold up their experiences as a warning about what happens when power is unchecked and when communities choose security over justice. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think differently about history or law enforcement or the narratives we tell ourselves about American justice, then I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, sharing similar stories you might know about, sharing your concerns about whether we've truly learned the lessons of cases like this. And please make sure you're subscribed to this channel and that you've hit the notification bell, because we're committed to bringing you more stories like this. Stories that challenge conventional wisdom, stories that expose the truth behind historical myths, stories that force us to confront uncomfortable realities about our past and present. Hit that like button if you found this video informative and if you believe these stories need to be told. Share it with anyone who you think needs to hear it, anyone who cares about justice, anyone who believes that history should be honest even when it's painful.
The final chapter in the story of Clayton Briggs came in 2011 when a graduate student named Maria Gonzalez was researching her dissertation on Mexican immigrants in the American West and came across the story of Carlos Rodriguez. Gonzalez was moved by Rodriguez's story and frustrated by the lack of any memorial or recognition of what had happened to him. She began a campaign to have Rodriguez officially exonerated and to have his death reclassified as a homicide rather than an accident. She gathered support from civil rights organizations, from historians, from the descendants of other victims of frontier justice. She presented her case to the Nevada Board of Pardons, to the state legislature, to anyone who would listen. And in 2014, after 3 years of effort, she finally achieved a small victory. The state of Nevada issued a statement acknowledging that Carlos Rodriguez had been wrongfully detained, that he had died as a result of abuse while in custody, and that his treatment represented a grave injustice. The statement stopped short of a formal apology and offered no compensation, but it was the first official recognition by any government entity that what Briggs had done was wrong. Gonzalez tried to extend her campaign to obtain similar recognition for the other 3 victims, but she ran into obstacles. Jacob Mercer and Daniel Cooper had no living descendants that could be located. Henry Blackwood's descendants were found, but they declined to participate in any public campaign, saying that they wanted to respect their ancestors' choice to leave the past behind and build a quiet life. So the official recognition of injustice remains incomplete and inadequate, just as justice for the victims of abuse of power so often is. But Gonzalez's efforts and Harrison's book before that and this video now all serve a purpose. They keep the story alive. They prevent the complete erasure of these men's suffering. They ensure that at least some people know the truth about Sheriff Clayton Briggs and the cost of the hero worship that surrounded him. The broader implications of this story extend into contemporary discussions about law enforcement, about the use of torture in interrogations, about the balance between security and civil liberties, and about how we memorialize historical figures who did terrible things. In recent years, as movements for police reform and accountability have gained prominence, the story of Clayton Briggs has been cited by activists as an example of how communities can be complicit in police brutality and how difficult it is to hold law enforcement accountable even when abuses are documented and acknowledged. The fact that Briggs was never charged with any crime, never faced any professional consequences, never even expressed remorse, and yet remained a respected figure until historical revisionism began to change the narrative decades after his death. This fact illustrates the structural protections that shield law enforcement from accountability and the cultural attitudes that prioritize order over justice.
When we look at the Briggs case through a modern lens, several things become clear. First, the torture of suspects is never justified, regardless of the seriousness of the crime being investigated or the certainty of the investigator that the suspect is guilty. The reason this principle is so important is illustrated perfectly by the Briggs case. All 4 of the men he tortured were innocent, and no amount of torture was going to produce truthful confessions because they had no crimes to confess to. Torture produces whatever the torturer wants to hear, not the truth. And any system that permits it is guaranteed to produce miscarriages of justice. Second, the community's responsibility to oversee law enforcement is not optional, it's essential. The people of Silver Ridge abdicated that responsibility because they were afraid, and because holding Briggs accountable would have required them to confront their own complicity, and the result was continued injustice. Third, the narratives we tell about history matter because they shape how we understand the present and imagine the future. As long as we tell stories about the Old West that celebrate rough justice and ignore its victims, we're perpetuating a cultural attitude that makes police accountability difficult to achieve. There's something profoundly disturbing about the fact that for over a century, Clayton Briggs was remembered as a hero. Children in Silver Ridge grew up learning about him as an example of frontier toughness and dedication to law and order. Books about Western lawmen included him as a figure of respect. His methods were taught, formally or informally, to other law enforcement officers as effective techniques for handling suspects. And all the while, the truth of what he had done, the torture, the death of Rodriguez, the destruction of innocent lives, was either unknown or deliberately ignored by those who preferred the comfortable myth to the uncomfortable truth. This is not unique to Briggs. History is full of examples of people who committed terrible acts and were nevertheless celebrated because the acts served the interests of those in power, or because confronting the truth would require too much moral reckoning. But that doesn't make it any less wrong or any less important to correct.
If you've stayed with this story to the end, if you've listened to the details of what was done to these 4 innocent men and the decades of injustice that followed, then you understand why these stories need to be told even when they're difficult to hear. The comfortable myths of history serve the interests of power, but the uncomfortable truths serve the interests of justice. And if we want to create a more just society, we have to be willing to face those truths honestly. Clayton Briggs was not a hero. He was a torturer and a murderer who hid behind a badge and who was protected by a community that valued its sense of security more than the rights of individuals. The 4 men he tortured were not criminals. They were victims whose lives were destroyed or ended by a system that failed them at every level. And the fact that this injustice was not only committed but celebrated tells us something important about the work we still have to do to create truly equitable justice systems. So I'll end with this. Remember their names. Jacob Mercer, who survived the torture but lost his faith in justice and died in obscurity. Daniel Cooper, whose body and spirit were broken and who sought oblivion in alcohol. Henry Blackwood, who endured unspeakable cruelty and chose dignity over vengeance. And Carlos Rodriguez, who came to America seeking a better life and found death at the hands of a lawman who faced no consequences. Remember them not as statistics or as victims in a historical anecdote, but as real people whose suffering matters, whose stories deserve to be told, and whose experience should inform how we think about justice and accountability today. Their torture at the hands of Sheriff Clayton Briggs is not ancient history. It's a warning about what happens when good people stay silent in the face of evil, and it's a challenge to each of us to do better. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think should happen to historical monuments and memorials that honor people who committed atrocities? Do you think communities have gotten better at holding law enforcement accountable, or do we still see the same patterns playing out? Have you heard of similar cases from history that deserve more attention? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation going. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel because we're going to continue exploring the dark truths behind the myths of American history. Hit that like button if you believe these stories need to be told, and share this video with anyone who cares about justice, anyone who believes that facing historical truth is more important than protecting comfortable myths. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll dive into another story that history tried to bury, but that we're going to bring into the light.